Okay, let's look at the last part of photosynthesis. We'll be looking at the Kelvin cycle, the second stage of the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so just now, right, in the previous video, you looked at the light-dependent reactions already, and we saw that light energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of ATP and reduced NADP. So in Kelvin cycle, the ATP and reduced NADP, right, made by the light-dependent reactions will be used to convert or to drive the conversion of carbon dioxide into glucose and carbohydrates. Okay, so there are three main phases of Kelvin cycle. The first is called carbon dioxide fixation, sometimes just carbon fixation. So the carbon dioxide, right, will be absorbed by the leaf, right, and that will go into the cells and go into the chloroplast and into the stroma. In the stroma, right, the carbon dioxide will combine with a molecule called ribulose bisphosphate or RUBP. RUBP is a 5 carbon long, right? So with the addition of 1 carbon dioxide, it forms a 6 carbon intermediate compound, which will be quite immediately split into 2 3-carbon molecules known as phosphoglycerate or PGA. Okay, and this addition of carbon dioxide to RUBP, right, to form that intermediate 6-carbon intermediate, is catalyzed by an enzyme called ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, or Rubisco for short. Okay, so this is on the screen you see the equation. So this is the first phase of Kelvin cycle, the carbon dioxide fixation. After that, right, the PGA that is produced, right, will undergo reduction. So this reduction reaction, right, requires both the ATP and reduced NADP made in the light-dependent reactions. Right, so the ATP and reduced NADP are made in the light-dependent reactions, right, which occurs at the thylakoid membranes. Right, so the stroma is just surrounding the thylakoid membranes, right? So the ATP and reduced NADP, once made in the light-dependent reactions, will then move into the stroma to power this PGA reduction step or phase of Kelvin cycle. Right, so the PGA, right, will be reduced to something called a triose phosphate. All right, it is also 3 carbon long. It's just a reduction, right? So no change to the number of carbons. The triose phosphate, right, is going to be what forms the glucose and subsequently the other carbohydrates, right? Because 1 triose phosphate is 3 carbon long, right? So 2 triose phosphates together will form a 6 carbon glucose phosphate. So that's the start of the formation of glucose, and from the glucose phosphate that can be used to form our maltose, our amylose and amylopectin, which are starch. The glucose phosphate or the triose phosphate, depending on the chemical reaction pathway, they are also the raw materials to form other biomolecules like lipids, like amino acids. Okay, so that's the reduction. After that, right, not all the TP, not all the triose phosphates are used to make glucose phosphate. Most of them actually remain in the stroma and remain in the Kelvin cycle. They will be used to regenerate the RUBP, ribulose bisphosphate. Because if we don't regenerate the ribulose bisphosphate, right, then the cycle cannot continue for the second round, right? We need the ribulose bisphosphate to accept another carbon dioxide for the Kelvin cycle to continue. So there's this very important regeneration of RUBP, which is the third main phase of Kelvin cycle. Okay, and this step, right, requires also ATP from the light-dependent reaction. But the reduced NADP is not needed. Right, so that is, in short, the Kelvin cycle. So just a summary, right, this happens in the stroma. The initial reactants would be ATP and reduced NADP formed in the light-dependent reaction, as well as carbon dioxide that's taken in from the atmosphere, and they will be used right? So the ATP after being used will become ADP and the inorganic phosphate, which goes back to the light-dependent reaction for ATP synthesis. Right, the reduced NADP after being used becomes NADP again, and again they will go back to the light-dependent reactions and continue to serve as the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. The carbon dioxide is taken in, right, and through the Calvin cycle will be used to make triose phosphate, which goes on to be made into glucose phosphate. So the energy conversion is chemical to chemical, but chemical in different forms, right? So chemical energy in the form of ATP and reduced NADP made in a light-dependent reaction drives the production of glucose phosphate and carbohydrates, which then carries this chemical energy. So that's Calvin cycle.